again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say.
Good morning. Welcome to NUFC Matters, the transfer show with myself, Steve Wraith, and Ben Jacobs. How are you, Ben?
Good morning. Busy times, exciting times for Newcastle.
It is. You haven't got an AC Milan top one, though. You've got an Inter Milan top one.
It is an Inter top on. So it isn't a nod to Tonali. It's actually a nod to CBS. Some of you that were eagle-eyed might have seen that the parent company of CBS, Paramount, were the sponsors during the Champions League final. So I'm winning brownie points with the company. Good lad.
Bit of sponsorship there, bit of promo. That's what we like to see. We don't mind. That's great stuff, mate. Good to have you on as always. We've got an hour, which is never long enough, really, with Ben. But we're going to try and get through as many of these. For one question. We'll try and get through as many as we can, though. And let's talk about Tonali, because it is in the headlines. And Geordie Tune for Life came straight in with a question, just asking, Fabrizio Romano is saying that there's no announcement over the weekend or early next week for Tonali due to technical reasons. Is it by any chance of being July the 1st due to the new financial fair play year starting? Thanks in advance. I mean, you're nodding away there, Ben. I would imagine it's a done deal. They'll go through the medical. There's no need to rush. They'll get it done. But it's, it all looks as if it's signed and sealed, more or less now with Tonali, and he will be a welcome addition to Newcastle's squad.
A very welcome addition. It's a done deal, as I reported a few days ago, and Newcastle had moved from being relatively 50-50, even pessimistic, when they came in around the 50 million euros mark, to realizing that a deal could be done. And obviously, due to the fact that the package has increased to 70 million euros or so, it means that it's an equivalent number to Alexander Isak. So it will be interesting to see when we get the full breakdown. And Isak was 65 plus 5 as to whether we can be calling this a club record purchase. And if so, for a player that's only 23 years of age, that's incredible ambition from Newcastle, and it shows you how highly they rate the player. And even though the window's all been about James Maddison or that type of player, this is the priority position for Eddie Howe. Of course, he wants both, and I still expect Newcastle to move in the market to get a more creative-minded midfielder. But the advantage of Tonali is that he's wrongly billed sometimes as a defensive midfielder when he's not. He's a number 8. And that is significant because it provides a lot more versatility. He's far more dynamic. He's direct. He can carry the ball through the midfield. He's decent with long passes. He's got some set piece quality. And where he's going to have to get up to speed with is Premier League quickness, because he makes up for perhaps a lack of what I would call lightning quickness with that acceleration over short spaces or speed of mind. And if you were just having a running race, I don't see him as being one of the quicker players. So you can get caught out at times in the center of the park, especially when people try and run through you or drag you out of position. And that's a learning area for him. But he's very calm. He's very versatile for a midfielder that plays in the centre. And I think he'll fit well into a 4-3-3. I was watching him for Italy under-21s playing in a kind of 3-5-2 on the right-hand side of the central midfield. And in that 5-man midfield, he was able to drop deep and hold at times, but also kind of wait and pounce. And by wait and pounce, I mean when on the ball, play a direct pass that sometimes can be simple, but if you're quick and positive, it can start off a phase of play. And you don't always notice that in football because you look at the phase that comes after it. Whoever provides the assist, whoever provides the wonder pass, whoever breaks forwards from wide areas, whoever scores the goal. But he's very, very good at linking up the play and spotting a pass. And I've compared him, which sounds a ridiculous comparison because some people say that he's got a sort of Pirlo aesthetic in terms of, yes, his look, but also some aspects of how he plays. But I was comparing him, laughably, having just said Pirlo, to Danny Drinkwater. And when Leicester won the Premier League, Danny Drinkwater was the unsung hero. Everyone focused on Kante, everyone focused on Mahrez, and everyone focused on Vardy. But Drinkwater just got a lot of 50-50s, won a lot of second balls, pushed the ball forwards quickly, and made sure effectively that phases of play continued in a very direct manner, and could also chip in with the odd goal as well. And Tonali is capable of all of that. So this is a big outlay by Newcastle, but they view the transfer fee as an investment, not an expense. And then the delay is just normal, really, because he's playing in the under-21 Euros at the moment. And regardless of the July the 1st thing, because you could announce it ahead of July the 1st if you wanted to. But I think that from Newcastle's perspective, they just want to make sure that there's no distraction at this point for the player, because he's only just started the Euros. He's obviously played a game. It's been a whirlwind 24 or 48 hours. And then I think the other aspect is just, and we'll hear mixed narratives on this, what actually went on the player side. Because my understanding, talking to Newcastle sources, as you'd expect, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to deduce that this will be the narrative from the football club and even potentially the player camp, is that he was very much sold on the package, and Newcastle, for a player that age, have kind of broken the bank to get the deal over the line. But you will read some reports in Italy that speak of how the player was told that it was too good to turn down, and he was asked to take the move, even though he was very happy at Milan. So we have to respect that, because Milan do need to sell, but naturally it's irrelevant from Newcastle's point of view. He's a Newcastle player now. And again, Newcastle sources have stressed repeatedly that he was very much sold on the vision, on the Champions League football, on the financial package, on the culture of the football club. So I don't think we want to get sucked into what really happened on the player side, but you'll definitely see an opposing narrative in the Italian media, and for balance, it's worth outlining. But from Newcastle's perspective, I think we can summarize this as just top target, big outlay, massive talent, and everybody at Newcastle is delighted that they've got it over the line and early.
Yeah, it's a great signing for me. It'll take the pressure and the shackles off Bruno. Somebody's already said in the chat as well that it's a hell of a midfield. If it can get Szoboszlai as well, it would be probably a midfield that's set for quite a few years. It'll be interesting. I just want to say welcome to Jay Welsh, who's a member. If you want to become a member, click membership if you're on your mobile phone. If not, click join on your computer. You can do that almost immediately. So moving on, Szoboszlai seems to have overtaken Maddison. The word coming out about Maddison seems to be that although Maddison wouldn't be, adverse to a move up north and signing for Newcastle and buying into the Eddie Howe, PIF backed, project, that it seems that Leicester are playing hardball on the price, which you can't blame them for. Let's face it, he's a prize asset. They've dropped out of the Premier League, and they're going to want to try and recoup. And plus, as we've discussed on the show already, they do have a percentage to pay to a previous club for Maddison, which means that they want to get as much as they can. So it looks as if the ship has sailed with Maddison after 3 failed attempts in 3 different windows. Szoboszlai now seems to be he seems to be in our sights, and Dan Ashworth seems to be using his aeroplane to full advantage at the moment.
He does. I mean, let's talk about Maddison first. I don't think that we can categorically rule Newcastle out, because they've obviously tracked the player for over a year. They've had historical bids that have been rejected. But as I've reported many times, Tottenham have also always been in that race as well. And people maybe think that it's a new drive from Tottenham, but I'm sure if we go back to even last summer, I was banging on about Newcastle and Tottenham, and not a great deal has changed in terms of those suitors, but Newcastle, having forked out a package of 70 million for Tonali, will now have to look at the finances. And still, if Maddison becomes available in the market for 35, 40 million, Newcastle can reignite that interest. But if Leicester, as you say, are playing hard ball, and they've been able to because they've had 2 willing suitors, even though nobody's actually placed a formal bid at this point, then it's harder for Newcastle at that 50, 55 million. But even without Tonali, if Leicester stick to 55 million or so, then I always think Newcastle would have walked away, because they don't see any real value in that deal. And the longer this drags on, the more Leicester will be in a weaker position, because it's ultimately a desire of the player to leave. And I think we discussed last time that Maddison and his partner are having twins, I think it is. They've been on a baby moon. They're looking to settle. They're looking to have a bit of stability. So I think James Maddison will want his future resolved quite quickly now. And the complication at the Spurs end has been that despite that historical interest, they're having to sort of rerun everything by effectively Ange Postecoglou, because Fabio Paratici's gone. Daniel Levy at least says that he wants to step back. Scott Munn is new at Tottenham. So you've got this dynamic where there's a lot of fresh voices and there's still no sporting director there. And as a consequence, it has to be made clear, I think, to the recruitment team with any spillover from Antonio Conte, what works for Ange Postecoglou, because there's a big jump between how Conte played via 2 interims to the sort of style that Ange Postecoglou expects. And I actually think that both Harvey Barnes and James Maddison would be good fits for the Postecoglou style. So Tottenham will be delighted if Newcastle back off. But again, we don't want to quite say that categorically at this point, because Maddison has been a big priority. And the week before Newcastle secured Tonali, indications still were that they planned on moving for Maddison. And what you don't want in a window is a lost cause. You don't want a situation whereby you plan to move, but deep down you realize you're going to get messed about, or deep down you realize you're not going to get a deal. And I think that this was where Newcastle was smart last summer. Fans perhaps look at it and say, well, we all knew we were going to move, so why don't we have the player? But if in moving you realize there's no deal there to be had at value, then you're smart to read the market, understand the reality, not get sucked into a game and walk away. And I think Newcastle have done that relatively well with various targets over the last few windows to ensure that they don't waste their time. There's no point in having a negotiation for show or to prove that you tried if you just genuinely believe that it's not going to come down to your maximum price that you're prepared to pay. So that's one aspect to this. And then obviously, as you say, you've got Szoboszlai, who's there as well. Now, I'm biased, of course. It's not often I would say that as a journalist, but of course I'm biased towards James Maddison. I would take Maddison over Szoboszlai, even if I had to pay more. And the reason for that is because Maddison is virtually guaranteed to get either close to or into double figures. I think it was 10 Premier League goals last season, plus all of the assists. And I think that would have put him as Newcastle's joint top third scorer last season. And if you add those 10 goals at Newcastle, plus however many assists, I think that that puts Newcastle in an incredibly strong position as far as getting back in Champions League football. Whereas with Szoboszlai, you have the advantage of the fact that he's a little bit younger. And on top of that, he offers a slightly different kind of quality to James Maddison. I think that he's probably, positionally speaking, just a little bit more versatile. So the key question really with Szoboszlai is what's going to be the price? And that, I think, is where there may be some doubt at Newcastle's end as to whether or not Leipzig will drop it to a level that makes the deal worth their while. So that's the thing to look out for next, really. Liverpool have looked at the player as well, and the feeling between January and the summer was maybe 55 to 60 million in terms of what the price tag might be. And I think that Newcastle may see that as a little bit too high. And obviously, if it is that kind of amount, they might go from Tonali, because remember, 70 million euros is about 60 million quid. They might go from Tonali to actually spending slightly more than Tonali, and then what's left for other positions. And I still think that Newcastle need a left back. So if they are going to move, and there is a very real chance that they do, then they'll definitely want to drive that price down a little bit.
Yeah, okay, it's an interesting one. It's certainly one that we're going to watch. We'll come to some questions in the chat. Ian McKenna mentions Chiesa and Hernandez, 2 other names that have been linked with Newcastle United in the last 7 days. And of course, with Dan Ashworth on his plane, anything is possible. But take those 2 players in separation. Chiesa first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really interesting one because absolutely superb player, first of all. So definitely one that Newcastle have looked at. I think that it's probably more likely at this stage that Aston Villa are the ones to watch because they're pushing a little bit more aggressively than Newcastle at this point. But Newcastle have looked for sure in terms of scouted the player, and they've also made an inquiry to look at the terms of the deal as well. But they'll learn a lot from the Aston Villa approach because I think Villa have already either made a verbal offer or at least intimated the direction they want to travel and basically had that deal turned away at this point. So in the same way when we saw the Barella links for Newcastle and immediately in Italy, there was a counter narrative that said nowhere near the valuation, deal's not going to get done. It's really, really difficult. I think that we've heard very similar things with Chiesa from the Aston Villa situation. So if Newcastle again want to move on this front, they're really going to have to break the bank. And that's why personally, I think that this deal is unlikely.
Okay, Hernandez is another one that's been mentioned on a regular basis. What's your thoughts on him?
Like the player, that's the first thing to say. I think that from Newcastle's perspective, you can see exactly what they are looking for in terms of profile. And whereas everybody else around Newcastle in the Big Six is perhaps looking a little bit close to home, Chelsea for Caicedo, Arsenal for Declan Rice, and of course, Manchester United for Mason Mount, and Arsenal have just signed Kai Havertz. So that's normal because the Premier League window's open and a lot of clubs are looking to get deals done early so they can put those domestic transfers on the books before June the 30th. But then when you look at Newcastle, they're largely going abroad. And I don't think that that will change significantly over the course of the window, unless, of course, they bring in Maddison. So as a consequence, I think that this tells you Newcastle's sort of strategy. And that strategy is very different because they're clearly trying to build for their future. They're clearly trying to get in a position where they spend big now, looking for depth, looking for quality, and looking for players that are 25 or under. So Theo Hernandez hits that cusp. And that might be why Szoboszlai gets the nod instead of Maddison, even though Maddison's only 26 years of age. The other thing about Theo Hernandez is that we know left back is a priority, and he's sort of known for that speediness, but also a goal scoring ability as well. So all of this adds up to being a very real possibility. Obviously, in doing the deal for Tonali, one would presume that there were some conversations if Newcastle wanted to move forwards. And the downside in some ways is that once money comes into Milan, there's always that opportunity to potentially play harder ball with another player. So I don't think this one is necessarily a given at this point. But again, the Newcastle interest is very real for sure. I think that fee-wise, it would take at least 40, 45 million, maybe even a little bit more than that. So this one, I think, may take a little bit more time. I'm not aware of any agreement being close at this stage. And I still think that there'll be other left backs or full backs available that are more budget options that could also be very useful to Newcastle. I think the last thing I would say as well is that I feel a bit sorry for Dan Burn. I don't know what you think, Steve, but I feel a bit sorry for Dan Burn because it's obvious when you just look at only the starting 11, not the squad, that Newcastle can strengthen there, which is why left back's a priority. And if you're being brutally honest, you're saying we're Champions League now. And the interview that Yasser Al-Rumayyan did with the club, he basically said, well, we've got the ingredients now to try and be number one, which is something you'd expect a chairman to say, but you can see the ambition. So if they want to take another step forwards or consolidate, and you're really looking at the best starting 11 for me anyway. Others might disagree. Dan Burn is not in it. So if I'm Newcastle and I'm looking to break the bank next in terms of bringing in a priority position, a starting left back is one of them. And it reminds me a little bit, I know it's a slightly weird thing to say now because it's so obvious, isn't it, in hindsight? But if you remember when we spoke at the beginning of last season, we had a big debate about Newcastle's back line, and the two things we were focusing on before a ball was kicked were who were going to be the two starting centre-backs. It wasn't that known at the time, and who was going to be the number one goalkeeper. And even that wasn't that known, not categorically when Nick Pope came in, because Dubravka was still there too. And it's strange that we would have that debate because it's so obviously Nick Pope as the number one, and it was so apparent so early in the season. But we were kind of having that debate at the time. And I think that Newcastle fans will be doing the same at the beginning of this season and kind of putting that starting 11 together. And there'll be certain players in the squad that maybe, based on last season, you'd say, why not give them a chance? And Dan Burn might be one of them. And this is going to be even more controversial, but Miguel Almiron might be another. And then if you're being really brutal, and you're saying, now we're Champions League, now we've improved, now we've signed people, who are the ones that are going to be the casualties when everyone's fit in your starting 11? That's where you take out Dan Burn, and that's where maybe even one or two others are susceptible. Because if Almiron doesn't rediscover the goal-scoring touch of the first half of the season, then it is true, somebody else might come into the side. So these are welcome headaches for Eddie Howe, but it just shows you that when you move as quickly as Newcastle have done, from relegation zone when Eddie Howe and the ownership were first trying to make their moves to now as Champions League, you have to be a little bit more cutthroat with your squad. And this is where, as I said before, I think that Dan Burn may miss out.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think Dan Burn's realistic about the amount of games he play next season. I think he accepts that. But domestic cups, we need a big squad. Carabao Cup, FA Cup, Premier League. There's going to be opportunities for him. You mentioned the interview. Stu mentions here, class interview with our chairman, His Excellency Yasser Al-Rumayyan on YouTube. What a really nice fella. We're lucky to have him as our chairman, one of the best we have had for decades. John Askew says the club's YouTube interview with Mr. Al-Rumayyan bodes very well indeed. He's not into second best, and unlike previous owners, we can actually trust him. Lots of people making reference towards his suit as well, which of course I think certainly impressed people. We talked, I think, probably last season about Newcastle's owners need to come out, need to be a bit more transparent, need to talk, need to speak. They're getting there slowly but surely, I think, aren't they? They are making themselves available. It's still very methodical, still very thought out, well thought out. Not getting drawn into any controversy, not getting drawn into any spats with people, and neither anybody working. Neither is anybody working at the club. So I think it was good. It certainly got the fans talking anyway.
Yeah, I think for many, many months, I've said that I would like Newcastle's majority ownership group, of which Yasser Al-Rumayyan represents and is the chair, to engage more. And I've made it clear categorically that I would love the opportunity to speak to him, as would countless media. And our line of questioning would be slightly different, fair, but different. But I've said at the same time that if they're not going to put themselves in front of the media, and no owner has that obligation to do so, it'd be nice. We'd like it. We're greedy. We want the story. We want to ask the questions. But if they're not going to do that, then engage with the fans. And if that's via the club, so be it. So a club interview is always going to be very well policed and to an extent rehearsed. But if you're going to do an interview on behalf of the club, then you're going to answer questions on behalf of the club. It's obvious that Newcastle United do not have a responsibility to ask their chairman about PIF and their moves in Saudi Arabia. That's probably as far as you could have pushed it, to sort of say, are PIF going to be expanding in 2023? Is anyone going to be added to the Newcastle club model? Or how is the relationship going to work with PIF owning 4 clubs in Saudi Arabia and Newcastle? But again, you wouldn't expect that in a traditional club interview. It's probably deemed to be the wrong side of the line, because these kind of interviews, they're there for the fan base to hear about their club, their season. So it was very much a reflective interview. And I think fair play, because they could have chosen not to do it. I haven't seen the Glazers do it. I haven't seen the Chelsea owners do it. I haven't seen the Manchester City owners do it. I haven't seen the Liverpool owners do it. So you have to give credit that they've finally come out and spoken, but you still have to give that scrutiny and say, are they going to come in front of the media and answer questions to us? Which is the same again for the Manchester City owners and for every other ownership group that has been less transparent and ultimately may have a responsibility to shed some light on certain things. But this was a Newcastle interview, and it was there to celebrate a phenomenal season for Newcastle, and it was for the fans, and it's to show the fan base that they care, they're ambitious, and they are prepared at times in a controlled manner to communicate. And I think that's absolutely fine. So I don't buy into this, how dare they speak to the club and not the media? And I don't buy into this, how dare they speak on record and not be asked about Jamal Khashoggi, sports washing, and so on. Because what do you expect? It's a Newcastle United interview. They're not there for that purpose. So obviously, this is part of the whole debate we've had many times around, once you do one interview like that, how authentic is it? How genuine is it? And if I'm a fan of my club, to be perfectly honest with you, and others might disagree, but if I'm a fan of my club, Leicester, I wouldn't only want to hear my owners do an interview with the club, because deep down, I know that it's going to be a bit more staged. And that obviously is where some people will say that the reality of information you may learn is a little bit skewed. So it's all very well hearing them say the right things, but you could have pre-scripted what he was going to say. So this is where the media exists, because we might put them out of their comfort zone. And as long as we're fair with our questioning and we listen, which is the most important thing to do in an interview, then you might actually learn something and you might be surprised by the answer that you get. And I think that's the next step, because so often we have these debates about ownership and transparency, whether it's relating to the takeover or whether it's relating to sports washing. So often we have it, and people have agendas and people create headlines. And sometimes there's very healthy, investigative, outstanding journalism that reveals the reality of a situation. But the reason why we have these debates and it turns toxic is because very rarely does the person directly involved address it. And obviously, the one way that Newcastle can end headlines around, oh, they're Saudi, they're going to spend billions, oh, they're Saudi, there's something untoward about it, oh, they're Saudi, they're trying to own football and use it to control the world, etc., etc. Whether it's right or wrong, one way they can end it is by answering the question rather than dodging the question. So the irony of it all is, if Yasser Al-Rumayyan sits in front of Ben Jacobs or whoever else, I'm sure he'll have bigger fish than me that he would like to sit in front of. But if he sits in front of a journalist and he's asked these questions and he answers them well, then he gains more respect. And then to an extent, he ends the cycle of they're saying this, but they're doing something else. They're spending this, but they're actually going to spend something else. There's some collusion with Chelsea. There's some collusion with the Saudi Pro League and Newcastle. There's some wider picture. They're not who they say they are. They're actually government. And I think if they actually address that, it would end a lot of the hullabaloo. Now, I'm not saying that they have to. I'm just saying they're never going to do that on the Newcastle United YouTube channel. So this is a good start. And I come back to what I said before, that my job is to try and get these interviews. And if I don't get these interviews, then I failed. It's not on Yasser Al-Rumayyan. It's ultimately on the journalist. And we try and we push and we put in the requests. And if they say no, they say no. And then if they go and do a club interview, fair play to them, because it's better to do something than nothing. And it's better to engage directly with the fans than to stay entirely silent. And if we can't get the interview, it's as much on us as it is on them. And as a consequence, we can't be kind of bitter about it. We can't be glib about it. We can't have a chip on our shoulder because they refused to talk about something that wasn't Newcastle in a Newcastle interview. We can just try and develop relationships, be fair with our journalism. And if we get them one day, we'll have a slightly different line of questioning, and then we'll see what answers they give. And if we don't get them, we don't get them, and we have to keep trying and do better to eventually try and get that interview.
Yeah, Mark Todd says, if Ben had the chance of interviewing the Glazers, would he question them about the atrocities of war the USA have caused over the years? I mean, you know, this is the problem, Mark, isn't it? It's where, you know, how long's a piece of string with all the owners? I've said what should happen is, you know, let's speak to all 20 Premier League owners at the start of the season, set up an independent committee, one that's a bit quicker than some of the government committees that get set up to investigate them, and just have a chat with all the owners, and let's find out who the owners are, what they do, who's got skeletons in their cupboard, and let's just get it all out in the open and then put it to bed. Maybe that's the best way of doing it. The mainstream media will never be satisfied when it comes to going after NUFC, says Chris.
I think, it's not about, for me anyway, it's never been about going after Newcastle. Great club, great fan base, great season, go and win the Champions League, and now Leicester aren't in the Premier League. Maybe I can even follow Newcastle a little bit more because I can have a Championship team and a Premier League team. But no, in all seriousness, for me, it's not about that, because as a journalist, if you get the name and they want to speak to you, you can be very thorough and fair. If you don't get the name, you almost have to just show you tried to ask the question by doorstepping them. And we see this a lot where people chuck a mic in front of a name whilst they're walking off somewhere. We saw it with Yasser Al-Rumayyan. We've seen it with the Glazers. We saw it with Todd Bowley as well. And you're almost there just to say, well, I know he's not really going to stop, but I'm going to show on mic that I at least tried, and stick a mic in their face. If they sit down with you, then they want to speak to you. And it's a very different vibe to that interview. So my desire with Al-Rumayyan and PIF is less about trying to trip them up or trying to come out with anything negative. And of course, there is that wider aspect. But if you think about it only in Newcastle terms, there's still a lot of unanswered club-specific questions that are not negative ones. They just haven't been addressed. And the big ones are obviously PIF. Are they going to add to the multi-club model, and where might they go next? PIF and their relationship with wider sport. How does Newcastle fit into that? How does Newcastle fit into the Saudi sports vision? How does Newcastle fit into the Saudi Pro League, which is growing? What's Al-Rumayyan learned by being involved in Newcastle, but also Live Golf? So what you have in Yasser Al-Rumayyan is not only a Newcastle United chairman, you have somebody that is almost becoming a bit like Nasser Al-Khalifi at PSG, who's involved with PSG, but also involved in QSI. So what fascinates me is not so much this somehow ability to sit in front of him on a high horse and start asking about all kinds of things to trip him up. We have a responsibility to ask relevant questions, of course, but I'm also interested about Live Golf has come. It's ripped through golf, and then it's unified golf. And now it looks like a game changer. And the Live Golf side is innovative in terms of its format. PIF are running 4 Saudi clubs, and they're trying to revolutionize the Saudi Pro League. Saudi might well get the World Cup. Saudi have got the Club World Cup. Where does Newcastle fit into all of that? And is there a connection? And a connection is not untoward. A connection, if anything, is expected. I would be surprised if it's Newcastle in a bubble and then everything else they're doing. It has to be linked. It would be sensible for it to be linked. So I think this is where journalists can help, because that's a really interesting conversation about strategy. That because it isn't only Newcastle, Newcastle's just a part of that strategy. You again wouldn't expect that on a Newcastle United club interview. And I would love him to explain that in depth, because it's fascinating really as to how Newcastle can grow. And to grow, you need help. City Football Group are not where they are now because they're just Manchester City. They're City Football Group. Chelsea are not moving in the direction they're moving. And I know that they're ultimately mid-table from last season, but I mean, strategically as a brand, they're not moving where they're moving because they're just Chelsea. They're Blueco. And they've just ultimately, as Blueco, the owners of Chelsea, invested in Strasbourg. So it can't just be Newcastle. It has to be Newcastle plus something. And clearly this was always in PIF's thinking. So where are we going to see Newcastle in the multi-club sense? Where are we going to see Newcastle in the PIF sense? Where are we going to see Newcastle in the Saudi sense? And that's not negative. That's just a fascinating conversation about modern football and modern sport. And again, I would love to have that conversation. So it's ultimately up to the owners. I think every other month I try and get something to see whether PIF will speak. And we have to wait and see. But what I would say is that just because the journalists haven't got the interview with Al Rumian, we shouldn't detract from the fact that he's still come out and spoken to the Newcastle United fan base. And whether we feel that's a staged interview or not, it's what the fan base were looking for. So this is the club serving a purpose for the fans. This is a club showing that their chairman will speak. And as I've said before, the Glazers haven't spoken, the Chelsea owners haven't spoken, the Liverpool owners haven't spoken, the Arsenal owners haven't spoken, etc. So this type of interview is welcome and it's a start, but you can have more than one type of interview. And as I've said before, if I don't get the interview with Yasser Al Rumian, it's as much on me as it is on PIF, because you get these interviews through persistence, hard work, and relationships. Maybe one day it will happen, but if it doesn't happen, the fact that this has been released for the fan base is a good thing for the fan base.
David Hanko, he's a Slovak, I believe, run about the 25-year-old mark, centre-half, Feyenoord defender, been linked with him today. Do you know much about him, Ben?
Yeah, I know about the player. I don't have a great deal to add on the links. Obviously, that may be a newer story. It's certainly not something that I've looked into from a Newcastle perspective. And if I don't know, I don't go into detail, but I can investigate that one. But I know the player pretty well. And one advantage of Hanko is he can play left back or centre back. And at 25 years of age, he has had a pretty decent season at Feyenoord. He did only join Feyenoord, though, at the beginning of this season. So that may make any kind of move a little bit more complicated. Again, I'd have to look into it. I don't really have any knowledge of Newcastle and their chances on this one. But he also was at Sparta Prague before, where he was excellent. And that was obviously what prompted the move to Feyenoord. And at Sparta, he was very much a goal scorer. And in the season, the full season before he joined Feyenoord, he scored 6 or 7 goals in the league. So I can understand why this profile is of appeal. And it may well be that others have got more on this transfer than me at this point. So if I have more on that over the coming hours, I'll let you know, but not a transfer that I've personally had time to investigate at this point.
Jordan Cronin from Newcastle World reporting that Dan Ashworth's been speaking to Marcus Thuram. Again, another one which could be on Newcastle's radar. We've spoken about him on the show before.
For Marcus Thuram, I think he's joining Inter Milan, and that one is pretty much done. So it will be very surprising if Newcastle hijack that deal. I think we've always seen these links with Newcastle and Marcus Thuram, and there's never been as much substance to it. I think Eddie Howe was even asked, wasn't he, after the World Cup, and said, the only thing I can tell you is it's been out there in the media, but there's really nothing more to it than that. So this one is not going to be a deal that ends well for Newcastle because the player's joining Inter Milan.
Yeah, and Danny from Leeds says that as well. So thanks for joining us today, Danny. It'll be interesting to see who Newcastle do manage to get in. Craig Lee, we've already spoken about Hernandez this morning. DeMarco, another left back. Anything on that one, Ben?
Yeah, DeMarco is a player that Newcastle have actually scouted for 2 windows, and I actually believe personally of all of the names in this position, it would probably be the best signing for Newcastle in terms of profile, experience, talent, and so on. And it will all depend on price here. And obviously, again, whether or not we actually see a scenario where Inter sell, they're going to have to sell somebody, but every time they're asked about their players, they deny they're for sale. With Onana, they want relatively crazy money. I know Manchester United have explored that deal with Lautaro Martinez not for sale, with Bastoni not for sale, and yet they want to bring in Lukaku and 1 or 2 others. So somebody is going to have to exit, and DeMarco would be a bit of a fan favourite, I think, if Newcastle were able to progress with this deal. So price-wise, I think that it might be a little bit cheaper than some of the other left-back options. I know some are saying that it's a sort of 30 million deal. I'm not so sure it'd be quite that low. You might have to add 5 or 10 million to it. But again, it's not just about the number. It's about the structure as well. Manchester United have looked at the player as well. And there is also a little bit of interest elsewhere too from one or two other clubs across European football. I know that Juventus have taken a look in the past, but more in January and last summer, and were not particularly sold, but let's see whether they change their mind. So I think there's a deal there to be had here. He's a left back that is relatively dynamic, I think it's fair to say, and would take quite well to the Premier League. Isn't the tallest, but it doesn't really matter with a left back. Has a good positional sense. And I think that one of the things I really like about him is just the intensity. If you remember when Bruno, even though they're obviously not the same position, when Bruno joined the club, there was a real feeling from day one that he bought into the atmosphere, bought into the fan base, bought into the intensity, bought into the tenacity needed to play in his position. And DeMarco is very similar. If he arrived at a club like Newcastle and walked out in St. James's Park, you just feel he's that kind of player that would raise his game week in, week out, because he thrives off that kind of atmosphere and intensity. And, you know, it's funny because you would say, how is that not every single player? But it isn't always. Some players block out the atmosphere. Some players keep a more neutral mindset, and that can be beneficial as well, because you don't want to have like major highs, major lows. Like I think back to João Felix on his Chelsea debut, and he clearly tried to raise himself and he played really well against Fulham, but then he also went in for a tackle that was reckless and got sent off. So intensity and buying in and getting sucked into the atmosphere isn't always a good thing, but DeMarco is the kind of player that wears his heart on his sleeve. So I do think he'd be a good fit for Newcastle. Okay,
slightly over halfway through the show, but we're going to have the ad break. The big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces, which are handmade in Cumbria. Their website is mrvickies.co.uk. If you want to contact the guys, email info@mrvickies.co.uk or telephone 01768 210 102. Big thanks to New Workwear. They are an agile and dedicated workwear provider launched in 2018. For more information, go to their website, newworkwear.com. Big thanks, as always, to Media Arts for the help with the video side of things. If you want to support the channel, hit the subscribe button, become a subscriber today. Hit the thumb up under the video, which likes the video, and click share to share to your other social media. Click join if you want to become a member of the channel for as little as $1.99, or take a one-off payment for the cult membership. You can get in via this QR code if you've got a smartphone, or look for membership pack on the website, nufcmatters.com. What do you get for your one-off £25 payment? You get a scarf, a pen, and a cup, and a membership card, and entry into the monthly draw. Don't forget, if you want a car sticker, all you need to do is subscribe to the show and then email John at NUFC Matters, and he will post you a free car sticker out. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. And we also support the food bank on this channel. NUFCfansfoodbank.co.uk is the virtual matchday bucket where you can make a virtual donation 365 days of the year. The new Alan Shearer raffle is underway. 150 tickets at £1 a ticket. You could win a limited edition signed Alan Shearer ball from the 260 dinner. Enter now at nufcmatters.com. We've got a few events coming up. August the 5th sees Gavin Peacock at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets are £10, and you can get them now from nufcmatters.com. Our Christmas event takes place on the 7th of December at the Tyneside Irish Centre, and that's an evening with Frank Clark. Tickets are £15 and available from nufcmatters.com. Finally, Waddle, Keegan, Beardsley and Friends, the class of 84, is on at the Tyne Theatre and Opera House on Westgate Road in Newcastle on Thursday, January the 23rd. Tickets are now available from the Tyne Theatre and Opera House.co.uk or telephone 0844 2491 000. That's the box office telephone number, 0844 2491 000. Okay, Ginny asked us, are we still interested in Gallagher and McTominay now that we've signed Tonali?
Yeah, McTominay may well be less of a priority. Newcastle very intent on moving. I think the thing about McTominay is that Manchester United were a little bit less decided on that one. So it was always going to come down to the player and whether or not he preferred a possible move to Newcastle where more first-team football was maybe guaranteed. I think McTominay, because he was such a long-standing target, again, pretty much since last summer, could still be somebody that Newcastle moved for, but now they've got Tonali less of a priority. And who was the other one in the question?
McTominay and Gallagher.
And Gallagher, yeah, I don't think Newcastle will move for Gallagher, but again, looking for that kind of box-to-box or attacking midfielder, but you got Szoboszlai, who obviously is versatile and can play in that position. You've got Maddison, who is a creative-minded midfielder. So Gallagher's probably fallen down the list, and maybe the reason for that is, again, because Chelsea are looking for something in the region of 40 million, and I don't think Newcastle necessarily have seen that as value. So the interesting Gallagher is historical, and whenever you have a player on the list and you're exploring them, they're very likely to just disappear entirely. In other words, a club would not rule them out. But as ever, you spin multiple plates during a window, and targets that were a bit further up the list can fall down the list. And you're always going to have to kind of rejig both your finances and your lists every time you bring somebody in. So I think Tonali will change some of Newcastle's priorities for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with on that, Ben. I think we might revisit Ekitike, as we need a third striker that can also play wide. I mean, Chiesa is probably the name that everyone was talking about earlier on. Ekitike, another one, Life Goals is chucking in, is do you fancy Wilfred Zaha and a free, so talented and more end product than ESM? Two names there of interest.
Yeah, everybody seems to be after Zaha at the moment. I'm not so sure that one will happen for Newcastle, nor do I think it's a priority, but it's a long window. Ekitike, we again know he was a concrete option, and it's funny because Newcastle ended up not getting Ekitike, and it all turned out rather well. And now you look at Alexander Isak and how he finished the season, plus Callum Wilson's goals, and you think that if Miguel Almiron can continue to score and find that first half of the season form, and then you bring in a creative-minded midfielder behind that can also score. Bruno chips in with a few. Joe Linton, I think, got 8 goals last season as well. So you start to wonder whether or not Newcastle would need Ekitike now, and that's the key thing, the word now, because Ekitike's gone to PSG and hasn't really found any rhythm and barely scored any goals. So if Newcastle signed Ekitike, PSG would still be looking for something in the region of 20, 25 million. Some even say 30 million. And he hasn't proven himself to be a goal scorer, and he doesn't get into that Newcastle starting 11. So if they see value in a young player and they can give him a pathway, it can never be ruled out, because they did really want him when PSG beat them to the signature. But Ekitike, the prospect, and Ekitike, the potential when Newcastle first looked versus now, he's not the same player. And I think that's really important to stress. So there's a lot of clubs looking at Ekitike. What I can tell you categorically from sources is that PSG do see Ekitike as on the market, and they would prefer to sell rather than loan. And as a result, there is a real window of opportunity for somebody. But it doesn't make much sense to me for Newcastle. It really doesn't, because I just don't think he did enough last season. I think it was 3 goals in Ligue 1 to suggest that he could have an impact at Newcastle. And as I emphasized before, if you're Ekitike, wherever you move next, you want game time. And I don't think he gets that game time at Newcastle.
No, I mean, I think Newcastle United have got, a way of doing business as well. And I don't think I like the way that all ended. I think they've moved on from that. Mark Todd has been known what sort of signings other clubs are wanting. At the end of the season, do you expect Newcastle to have made more progress than them towards the top of the league?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because you would expect Newcastle to be stronger on paper, but how do they balance the Premier League and Champions League? And it can always be a little bit difficult. It will be the first time ultimately that Eddie Howe has had to do that. So I think we're going to be in a slightly strange scenario at the beginning of the season where we're judging teams on paper. And when you judge Newcastle on paper, there'll be sky high expectation. And then the reality will be, for me, a little bit different. Because Manchester City are going to be top. I'm convinced of that. And then I think it's so tight between all of the other teams. So I think that Newcastle will finish above Manchester United. That's my personal opinion. But if they get new owners, if they got Kane, I reserve the right to change that opinion.
It's never happened, Ben. That's the only team in the Premier League. Newcastle have never finished above Manchester United.
Yeah, and I think that they will finish above Manchester United, in my opinion. I really think that that will be the case. And the reason for that is just because Manchester United don't have a traditional number 9 at this point. And budgetary-wise, it's going to be very difficult for them to get one. But again, I reserve the right to completely U-turn on that prediction if they bring in a 30-goal-a-season scorer, because I think they're the kind of team that's what they're lacking to take a big step forwards. And then I think Liverpool are the intriguing ones because I expect a resurgence, and obviously the same for Chelsea as well. So when we look at the beginning of the season, I think Chelsea will just look strong on paper. Whether or not they can go from 12th all the way back into the top 4 remains to be seen, but it's basically their only focus. So that's kind of bad news for Newcastle because they can have a much more consistent 11. Everything's driven towards Premier League. There's no real distractions. If they don't go far in the FA Cup or the League Cup, it won't be a big deal if they finish in the top 4 and take a big step forwards. And I look at Chelsea and I think, wow, on paper at least, if they can get Caicedo plus Enzo with Fofana, Badiashile, Colwell, James, Chilwell, maybe a new goalkeeper. If they start scoring, really, really strong. And on paper, really, really strong. But they were quite strong last season and they finished 12th. So they're a bit of a red herring or a blue herring, whatever you want to call them. But I think that they will look as strong, if not stronger than Newcastle on paper. But paper means nothing. And then I think Liverpool are really intriguing as well. Arsenal, I don't know. Again, I want to reserve judgment on them until they get Declan Rice in, or if they get Declan Rice in, because Kai Havertz, for me, could be a revolution or could be a flop. And if he's a flop, then are they going to actually take a slight step backwards? And they're a bit of an unknown quantity. So there's too many sides that just look the same on paper. And this is the beauty of the Premier League. So I fancy Newcastle to finish in the top 4, but I don't think it will be comfortable. I think it's one of those seasons where a good season for Newcastle would be to be in the race for top 4 again, in a tight race, to sneak 3rd or 4th. And if they get that on the last game of the season with a last-minute winner, then you're delighted with that. But to expect Newcastle to be comfortably in the top 4 or to be doing what Arsenal did last season and leading or challenging for the Premier League, I think that's a touch ambitious. So, yeah, I think Manchester City is stronger than Newcastle. I've got a sneaky suspicion that one of Liverpool or Chelsea will finish above Newcastle. And then I can see Arsenal and Newcastle being quite tight for 3rd or 4th. And then I actually think Manchester United might be 5th next season.
Well, thoughts on Leicester? Will they bounce back? I think it was Tom Dixon was asking that before. I think a few others asked, or Eamon asked as well. Do you think Leicester will come straight back up?
I mean, I have to say yes. If I am talking as a fan, as a journalist, I'm worried because when you are, and I mean this obviously very glibly, too good to go down on paper, but you go down, then there's obviously a higher chance that you lose a massive amount of your players, and you have to because Leicester pay big wages. So I would almost rather be Southampton than Leicester because they've gone down with a squad where they're going to lose some, of course, like Lavia, but maybe not that many. And suddenly all these players that haven't performed for Southampton that are quite young, Bella Ketchup, great player, for example, or Salisu, who barely scored a goal but looked like a world beater against Liverpool on the final game of the season, they might crush it in the Championship. Whereas with Leicester, yes, right now, if we play a game with the squad we've got, we'll sail straight back up. But come the first game of the season or the end of the window, if Leicester lose Maddison, 99% sure to lose Maddison. If Leicester lose Barnes, 90% sure to lose Barnes. If Leicester lose Castagne, 75% sure to lose Castagne. If Leicester lose Iheanacho or Ndidi, who would be great Championship players, then you suddenly look at that squad and say, uh-oh, because it was always a bit thin in terms of numbers in the Premier League. So what's important for Leicester is weirdly to keep the players that were criticised in the Premier League but are going to be really strong in the Championship. Like, I take Iheanacho all day long in the Championship. I think he scores 20 plus goals easy. But if you lose that kind of player, plus your Maddisons and your Barnes, then I can't tell you about Leicester's chances because I don't know what our starting 11 is, because I'm factoring in my Leicester perspective based upon 6 or 7 that I hope will stay. And then the other 4 or 5 are based upon who comes in because Maddison, Barnes, Castagna, etc. go. So you can have a lot of transition because so many Leicester players are on the market. So I hope we come back up. If in our side come day one of the season is Iverson in goal, Christiansen, Suter, Ndidi, Iheanacho, Vardy, then yes, my prediction is Leicester will come back up. But if some of those players go as well, then I'm panicking and I'm thinking we might be in a bit more trouble.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And as you say, a little bit early maybe for predictions for leagues, etc. We'll wait and see who is where when we get into August, when we're speaking to Ben. Then the Bassman reign. Sorry, do you think the 22-23 season above expectation and this one will be back down to earth? It depends on recruitment, Bassman. That's the key. Newcastle get their recruitment right and have luck with injuries and suspensions with an increased fixture list. Then it might be a surprise for people out there. Newcastle might just hold their own and do well. And I think, like Ben says, top 4 would be realistic again for Newcastle. A nice run in the Champions League out of the group stages would be great. That would be deemed a success, I think, for Newcastle. And again, a good run in one or both of the domestic cups. Maybe another cup final, but this time lifting the trophy would be fantastic. Newcastle should target the League Cup again. I keep saying it, but the League Cup is the one trophy. If you start with that and you winning your first one is always the most difficult, then the rest will follow it. It's as simple as that. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I do want to just touch on a couple of texts from people about players. Do you think we might move for some of the relegated teams players like Nondo and Adams from Leeds, Bella Kotchap, Livramento from Southampton, potentially some bargains there? And I think he asked a question earlier on as well. Am I mistaken? I think somebody else had asked. Yeah, it was Sean. With financial fair play in place, should Newcastle go for out-of-contract players? As there seems to be a lot of talent in that pool as well. Obviously, a few names mentioned there. So yeah, out-of-contract players, relegated team players, Supermax mindset on relegated players. If you start aiming for relegated players, you end up with a team that was relegated. So I always get that point. But there's a few bargains to be had, I think.
I mean, Skriniar's not one of them. He's off to PSG already. There's always that opportunity to take a player that's either shortly out of contract or is out of contract. That's ultimately what Saudi Arabia are doing with some of the older players. It's interesting that Newcastle didn't come in for Neves. He still had time on his contract, but there were historical links there. So yes, there are some players on the market that are available at value. Rabiot is one of them, but Newcastle are not one of the clubs looking at this point. With the relegated players, I think there's a few, and you can still get relegated and have had an outstanding season. I think that James Maddison, particularly in the first half of the season for Leicester, falls into that category. I think Bella Kotchap is an excellent player. And remember, with Southampton, a lot of these names are young. So it's all very well saying, I don't want a relegated player, but some of these names are young and learning. And if they've shown potential and got relegated, and then they were to move to Newcastle, then they may excel. with Livramento, I would take him all day long. And the reason for that is because he is an absolutely outstanding fullback who has had horrific luck with injury. So he's not responsible for Southampton's relegation. He's been out the side for pretty much all the season due to injury. I think he only made a few cameo appearances in the last few games of the season. And he's an absolutely phenomenal talent. And I think that Chelsea have got a buyback clause, but I don't think that it's valid at this point. So he could be one to watch for a number of clubs for sure. And I still wouldn't rule out James Ward-Prowse going somewhere either, because of what he can offer for set pieces. And anybody that's looking for that type of area and position will be able to maybe get a little bit of a bargain there, because I don't know if he'll necessarily want to stay at Southampton and in the Championship either. Tyler Adams is another one. I don't think Newcastle are a club to watch there, but there's definitely a few Premier League clubs looking and seeing whether there's a window of opportunity. And obviously from Adams's point of view, he'll be very much looking to get back into the Premier League as soon as he possibly can. So let's wait and see. Not every club that's gone down is in the weakest position whereby they have to sell immediately, because you do get those parachute payments to help with that transition going down. So I think Leicester have got their hands tied a little bit because of the stadium renovation costs and the money that they spent on their training facility. I think that Leeds are a bit more of a wild card because 49ers enterprises are coming in. So we don't really understand their budget and how bullish they're going to be in terms of keeping hold of players. And not every Leeds player on the market has got a relegation clause. And then with Southampton, the thing to understand is they're young. A lot of these players are young, like Bazunu, the goalkeeper, Bella Kotchap and so on. And if they're young, you have to kind of understand that maybe they're invested in that project for a few more seasons and will help Southampton come back up, which is why I think Southampton won't lose as many as certainly my club, Leicester.
Ben, that hour flies over far too quickly. Absolute pleasure to have you on, as always. I know you've got to get away, but thanks for coming on, mate. Look forward to seeing you again, hopefully next week. Take care, pal.
Have a good week, everyone. And the next time we speak, Tonali will be official.
Yay! Take care, mate.
See you later.
We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email john@nufcmatters.com to arrange today.